of our shift when Jerry dropped the wrench, and he just looked up at me and said, "I'm not about to get suited up and go into overtime to pick up a wrench." He was going to hold his breath, get down, and then right back out right away. Well, he got to the wrench, picked it up, but he never made it to the ladder. He had passed out. I called down to him, but he didn't answer back. It was hard to leave him, but we had to assemble the emergency rescue team. By the time they got him out, I took one look at him, knew that was it. It just doesn't seem fair. We had worked together like 8 years in maintenance. They left a wife and a daughter, a little baby boy. No one can replace a man's life.
Imagine yourself trapped in a sewer full of deadly carbon monoxide, unable to escape the poisonous gas, buried alive in a bin of choking sawdust, or caught in an oil refinery tank when it explodes into flames. Fatal accidents like these have actually happened, but they could have been prevented by following the standard for permit-required confined space entry published by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. This program will help you understand how to identify permit spaces and their hazards, the OSHA Permit Space Program, how an entry permit can keep you safe while you work in confined spaces, and the training and duties of a confined space entry team. A confined space is any area large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform assigned work, has limited means for entry and exit, and is not designed for continuous occupancy. Some examples of confined spaces are reactor vessels, tanks, silos, boilers, sewers, and pipelines. Because of their size, shape, or the potential for serious hazards, confined spaces may pose special dangers to workers who enter them. To protect confined space workers, OSHA has developed a program to identify spaces that have hazards which place workers in danger. These spaces with recognized hazards become permit-required spaces or permit spaces. Any permit space has any one or more of 4 characteristics. 1. Contains or has a potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. 2. Contains a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant. 3. Has an internal configuration such that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross-section. 4. Contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. So, what makes permit spaces so dangerous? First, there's the atmosphere. Air doesn't move into and out of permit spaces easily, so flammable or toxic vapors can collect inside. Even clean air can be deadly if it doesn't have enough oxygen in it to support life. Because of these hazards, the OSHA standard defines entry as placing any part of your body across the opening of a permit space. If you break the plane of the opening, you're affected by the atmosphere and other potential hazards of the permit space, and that means you could be in danger. Other hazards are caused by the limited area inside a space. In tanks and silos, there is always the danger of engulfment, that is, sinking in liquid or being buried by finely divided solid materials such as sawdust or grain. Danger from the unexpected movement of machinery is greater in a confined space since you have less room to get out of the way. Injuries from other accidents, such as electrocutions, falls, and heat exhaustion, are also more likely to occur in confined spaces. Sometimes just the shape of a space can be dangerous. Workers have become wedged into a narrow portion of a confined space, such as a chute, and suffocated because they can't move their chest enough to breathe. The difficulty of getting into and out of a permit space makes any of these hazards even more serious. And if you need help, rescuers can have a tough time reaching you and getting you to safety. The first step in a good permit program is to evaluate each confined space in the workplace and determine which of them must be classified as permit-required spaces. Employers then must warn employees about permit areas by using signs or any other effective means, and may also erect barriers to prevent unplanned and unauthorized entry. Take these warnings seriously. The next step is to identify the specific hazards of each permit space before entry. Employers then develop procedures to control these hazards and train their employees to follow safe entry and work procedures. The employer also provides appropriate safety equipment and makes sure thoroughly trained and equipped emergency services are available. If a contractor or other outside employer plans to send workers into a permit area owned by another company, he must be informed of all hazards and any required control measures. The contractor's employees are then responsible for using correct entry and work procedures. When identifying possible hazards, it is important to understand that conditions in a permit space can change. Sometimes the work itself makes things more hazardous. For example, welding or other hot work uses up the oxygen in a confined space and can also release toxic or flammable materials that have been absorbed into the walls. Sanding, scraping, and loosening scale can stir up toxic or flammable substances. Sometimes workers bring potentially hazardous materials such as paints and cleaning solvents into the permit space with them without thinking about the dangers. Even work outside a confined space can make conditions inside more dangerous. For example, work in nearby areas might produce harmful vapors that could collect in the permit area. Or hot work just outside a confined space could increase the danger within it. The key to a safe permit space program is the permit itself. The entry permit is a form which encourages orderly planning of confined space entry and work. The permit provides written authorization for work in any permit-required space. Because different workplaces have different hazards, individual companies may choose the specific format of their permits. Whatever its format, a permit always identifies the hazards of the space and lists the safety measures used to control these hazards before entry and throughout the entire period of work. Any hot work in a permit area requires special authorization. This may be a separate hot work permit, or it can be attached to your basic entry permit. Let's look at some of the items on a typical entry permit. The permit requires certain information. The permit must identify the permit space, state the purpose of the entry, give the date and authorized duration of permit. The permit must provide a way to identify all employees authorized to enter the confined space and list by name attendants and entry supervisors. It must also have space for the name and signature of the entry supervisor authorizing entry and work. The permit also must identify hazards of the space, methods for isolation and elimination or control of hazards before entry, acceptable entry conditions, results of initial and periodic atmospheric testing with initials of the tester, the rescue and emergency service to be summoned, and the means to do so, communication procedures between attendant and entrant, the necessary equipment for safe entry and work, such as PPE, testing equipment, ropes, and harnesses, any other information needed to ensure safe entry and work in the permit space. Before entry can begin, The permit space must be isolated to keep potentially hazardous energy or materials from being released. Isolation from hazardous materials is often done by blanking or blinding pipes, or by disconnecting pipelines and capping the ends. Ways of preventing energy release include de-energizing electrical circuits, decoupling mechanical linkages, and securing movable parts. Once the space has been isolated, make sure the isolation stays in effect by following your company's lockout-tagout rules. Cleaning a permit space is often necessary to eliminate hazardous vapors or residues. Depending on the materials that might be present, the best method may involve flushing, scrubbing, steam cleaning, or purging the space or inerting the atmosphere. Your company will choose a procedure that is best suited to each situation in your workplace. Mechanical ventilation of a confined space with fans or porta-vents can help control a hazardous atmosphere. Begin ventilating the space well in advance so that the air quality will be acceptable before anyone enters it. Remember, confined spaces are not uniform in shape, so make sure all areas are ventilated. If atmospheric hazards could reform, keep ventilators operating as long as the space is occupied. Since ventilators require power, be prepared with a backup power source should primary power fail. Atmospheric testing is an important part of verifying that permit spaces are safe to enter. Use only approved equipment and maintain and calibrate all testers according to the manufacturer's specifications. Safety experts recommend that the first atmospheric tests be performed by remote probe before anyone enters the permit space. Test all areas and levels of the space, since heavier hazardous vapors will collect at the bottom, while lighter ones will collect at the top. In any permit-required confined space, first test to make sure there is enough oxygen to support life. If the atmospheric concentration is less than 19.5%, OSHA considers the air oxygen deficient. If the concentration is greater than 23.5%, the atmosphere is oxygen enriched. Air that contains too much oxygen increases the danger of fire. After the oxygen test, check atmospheric flammability. This is measured in terms of the lower flammable limit, LFL. The LFL is the lower limit at which a flammable substance will ignite into sustained combustion. OSHA considers the atmosphere in a confined space to be hazardous if it contains a vapor, gas, or mist concentration of more than 10% of its LFL, or if airborne combustible dust is at a concentration that meets or exceeds its LFL. A dust concentration that obscures vision at 5 feet may be considered hazardous. The third test is for toxicity. If you know of any hazardous substances that have been stored in the space or could be present in it, use the appropriate detector to check for those materials. For most materials, toxicity is measured in terms of the permissible exposure limit, or PEL. This is the concentration of the toxic substance in the air that most people could safely be exposed to over an 8-hour workday. In a confined space, any concentration of a toxic substance greater than its PEL or other published safety limits is hazardous. When the atmosphere of a permit space is hazardous according to any of these tests, the hazard must be controlled before entry is allowed. Usually this is done with ventilation. If ventilation is used, retest the air with the system on. If a confined space is vacated for any length of time, retest the atmosphere before re-entry. To guard against the atmosphere becoming unsafe while work is in progress, it should be either 1, tested periodically, or 2, monitored continuously. If conditions become unacceptable, the space must be evacuated, the permit canceled, and work stopped until the problem is corrected. In areas where heat stress is possible, one more test should be performed by using a wet bulb globe thermometer, which measures the effect of temperature and humidity. These tests can show when employees' work-rest cycles should be adjusted to prevent heat-related casualties. Many permits list special electrical tools, lighting equipment, and other safety apparatus. Some of these items protect against electrocution and fire caused by sparking. These measures include low voltage, spark-proof tools, ground fault interrupters, and proper grounding of the vessel itself. Other equipment provides a safe way of getting into and out of the permit area. In some confined spaces, fall arresting equipment, such as a work platform, is necessary. The permit lists personal protective equipment, or PPE, necessary for safe entry and work, based on the hazards and needs of the specific job. This equipment must meet OSHA standards, and you must keep it in good shape. Always use the exact type of PPE specified on the permit, since substitutes might not protect you. For example, substituting an air purifying respirator for the airline respirator specified on a permit could cost you your life. Air purifying units are useless in an oxygen-deficient atmosphere because they don't supply oxygen. They only filter impurities from the air. The permit lists any equipment or procedures needed for communication between those inside and outside the confined space. For example, when voice communication is impossible, radio equipment or hand signals can be used. Since attendants can be posted at more than one space at a time, a video monitor and control room may be necessary. Regular prearranged check-in between entrant and attendant can reveal behavioral change indicating the entrant is in trouble. An alert attendant can then order evacuation or rescue. Before entering a permit area, make sure any necessary on-site rescue equipment is in place. This often includes a retrieval line attached to a body harness or wrist harnesses. You should also have hoisting equipment when vertical exits are required. The permit also names the emergency service to be called, whether it's an in-plant team or one from off-site. Devices for summoning the rescue teams, such as whistles, phones, or radios, must also be available. Safety experts recommend that emergency phone numbers and the location of a written emergency rescue plan also be entered on the permit. Rescue equipment and services available before entry can save vital time in an emergency. Yet remember, self-rescue has proven over and over to be the most effective method of confined space rescue. Safe confined space entry requires cooperation between entrant, attendant, and entry supervisor. The entry supervisor makes sure conditions are safe before anyone enters the permit area. He also verifies that the permit form is filled out completely and reviews it to be sure acceptable entry conditions exist. Then he signs the permit, and only then is entry allowed. If conditions become unacceptable, the entry supervisor must cancel the entry permit and order everyone out of the space. All hazards and their causes must be identified, controlled, or eliminated. The permit can then be reissued and work resumed. The entry supervisor is also responsible for removing any unauthorized people in or near the permit space. And when work is complete, the entry supervisor cancels the permit and concludes the operation. As an attendant, you must stay at your post to observe conditions and make sure they are safe. You will have no other responsibilities that conflict with this basic duty. Like the entrant, you must know the hazards of the area and the symptoms of exposure, so you will be able to react quickly if there is trouble. Part of your job is to keep an accurate list of the authorized entrants inside the permit space, and you must communicate as necessary to monitor entrant condition and alert everyone to evacuate. You must also warn any unauthorized persons away from the space. If anyone enters the permit area without authorization, inform both entrants and entry supervisor. Perhaps your most important duty is to order all entrants out of the confined space if they are in danger. Order the evacuation in any of these situations. You observe a condition not allowed by the entry permit. You notice symptoms of exposure in any entrant. You see a situation outside the confined space that could endanger entrants or any other reason you cannot effectively and safely perform your duties. If entrants need to escape from hazards in the permit area, summon the designated rescue team immediately. Perform any non-entry rescue as you have been trained to do. Do not enter the permit space yourself unless you're properly trained in confined space rescue and specifically relieved by another attendant. Before you enter any permit area, you must know the personal protective equipment needed and how to use it, the hazards present, plus their possible effects, and the symptoms of exposure. For example, lack of oxygen is a hazard in many confined spaces. Oxygen deficiency affects fine muscle control, which means you can't grip tools or a ladder. When your oxygen level drops, you may experience confusion, difficulty breathing, ringing in the ears, and finally, death. As an entrant, you must maintain contact with the attendant. He is your link to outside help. Leave the space immediately whenever the attendant orders an evacuation. But realize that the quickest way of reaching safety is to rescue yourself. If you initiate an evacuation, notify the attendant. Life-threatening seconds can be saved if you're prepared to leave the confined space quickly and, if possible, without help. Working safely in a permit space takes teamwork. Everyone has a role to play, from the person authorizing the entry and making sure that conditions are safe, to the attendant carefully monitoring the entrant and operation, and finally to the entrant who follows the permit and understands the hazards of the confined space. If each member of the team knows what to do and acts responsibly, any worker who enters a permit-required confined space will exit it in good health.